Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I'm Gautam Choubey, your host, and this is a show about books of Bharat. The book this week is How I Became a Tree. It was impossible to rush plants, to tell a tree to hurry up. In envy, in admiration, and with ambition, I decided to call that pace tree time. I was tired of speed. I wanted to live to tree time. So writes Dr. Sumana Roy. Drawn to trees' wisdom, their non-violent ways of being, their ability to cope with loneliness and pain, Roy movingly explores the lessons that writers, painters, photographers, scientists, and spiritual figures have gleaned through their engagement with tree. Stunning meditations on forests, plant life, time, self, and the exhaustion of being human evoke the spacious, relaxed rhythms of the trees themselves. Hailed upon its original publication as India's love song to plants and trees, How I Became a Tree blends literary history, theology, philosophy, botany, and more, and ultimately prompts readers to slow down, to imagine a re-enchanted world in which humans live more like trees. Sumana Roy is an associate professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University. Her books include Missing, a novel, My Mother's Lover and Other Stories, and 2 poetry collections, Out of Syllabus and VIP, Very Important Plant. Her poems, essays and stories have been published in the Paris Review, Orion, LitHub, The Point, Granta, among others. Provincials, Postcards from the Peripheries, her most recent book, has just been published in the US and will be published in India the next month. We are joined in the studio today by the author, Sumana Roy.
Thank you.
Dr. Roy, welcome to the show. Welcome to Likhawat.
Thank you for having me, Gautam. I'm very happy to be here.
This is a different kind of a book. Of late, there's been a spurt in academic and other discourses on environment and ecology, and one is therefore tempted to place your book in that context. And yet, one notices a marked difference. There are no traces of pedantry or sophistry that may alienate a reader. In that sense, it makes the right noise, the way I see it, or rather, the right melody. So tell us about your process and why you chose to write it so differently.
Thank you, Gautam, for noticing these things. I wasn't sure I had started out to write a book. I have said this before, and now it feels like I am quoting myself almost, having spoken about it multiple times in the last 6 or 7 years since this book has had its own life. I was going through a very difficult time in my emotional life, and I wanted to reach out to a form of living outside the human social. So, migrating and moving through, do I want to live like a dog? Do I want to live like a ceiling fan? And then suddenly being very unwell with jaundice, lying down on my bed, noticing the shadows of dancing papaya leaves on the white ceiling of my bedroom in Shiliguri. Something shifted in me, and I thought to myself, I have not done anything to deserve this. I wasn't the pollinator for this papaya plant, and yet it has given me something. And I thought, because I was looking for a life outside the emotional economy of the human social, I thought maybe I could want to live like a tree. And that thought stayed with me for a number of years, making me feel very abnormal. And then I felt, is it possible that I am the only abnormal human in the history of human civilization who has wanted to live like a tree? And so this quest began. And remember, Gautam, all of this was happening very secretively. This is such a silly desire. It cannot be shared with anyone in the world. So this became a quest, looking for Siddhartha, who would become Gautama, by sitting under a tree, finding that Jagadish Chandra Bose, who kind of proved to the world that plants were living beings, and he also said sentient beings, which is now only being proved today, in spite of much opposition over the last 100 years. I discovered that he did not have biological children of his own, in that we were similar. So discovering filmmakers, artists, writers, just as part of this quest to feel slightly less abnormal. So, what you are saying, perhaps, or what you are thinking of as research, was not research, was just a very emotional, which would later turn into an intellectual experiment.
And it's almost invisible. The amount of research one can see, a discerning reader can see that it has been put together quite painstakingly, but it's invisible.
Because I wasn't going to an archive, I was making notes on my way to work, sitting on the pot at night, in the bathroom, in the toilet, and so on, in different places. I did not have money to buy a laptop for myself at that point of time. I was making notes everywhere. When I could afford to buy a laptop for myself, I began feeding these notes to the laptop, and suddenly it began to seem to me that there was a pattern there. And while having this telephonic conversation with you, you mentioned something about the form. So the form that would become, which is how I became a tree as you read it today, has been very organic. There has been no control on my part that I want it to look like this, or I want it to come from this botanical space. Believe me, it sounds very selfish to say this, but I must be honest that my urge was not towards a rescue of the botanical. It was first to rescue myself. And so the gravitational pull of the botanical rescued me. So it is only now that I begin to see that the form of the book does not derive from all these disciplinary categories,
Right.
Anthropocene and so on. The form of the book is less like a tree and more like grass. You can read any section
Yes.
whenever you want to.
Sumana ji, when I think of the way trees are portrayed in contemporary popular culture, to be a tree is to be in a state of inactivity. In fact, we use the adjective vegetative to describe somebody who has slipped
terrible
in
word, yeah.
coma. And yet, when I think of my school years in the 90s and the way we associated with trees and plants, we always felt they could emote. And part of it stemmed from the fact that we were reading books and poems and stories about tree. We felt that spring was full of joy because we read Sarveshwar Dayal Saksena's I Mahant Vasant. We also felt that flowers were capable of patriotism because we were taught Makhanlal Chaturvedi's Pushpiki Abhilasha. So clearly books and poems about tree had major influence on us and the way we looked at trees. Is there a favorite poem or a tree about a tree or a book about tree that you would like to share with the viewers? What do you think of the literature on trees and plants?
It's almost an encyclopedic question. It requires me to say much more than the space of this program might allow. Just think of when you begin going to school, you are taught A for apple. If you go to a Bangla or Hindi medium school, A se aam. The introduction to literacy through plant life is so naturalized that we do not realize it. A few things here. One is, just as I dislike this category of women-centered or women-oriented films, as if the obverse, male-oriented films should not include women and so on, I dislike the category nature writing, simply because I do not believe in this binary that I am outside nature or that you are outside nature. I am as much nature as the plants outside the studio where we are recording. And to be aware, I think what that has done is this binary, this distance that has been forced on us, by two things. One, an academic discourse, very professionalized academic discourse. The other has to do with, of course, industrialization and so on, moving to the city, has made us feel that nature needs to be experienced almost only as a weekend activity. You know, the fact that the kind of place that you have described to me in Jharkhand, where you grew up, or the kind of place in Shiliguri where I have grown up, all of these have annotated our understanding of plant life in a way where we are not conscious of plant life. And that is the kind of literature I like, Gautam. I remember that I became conscious of my upper arm only when it broke. We become conscious of our heart only when we suffer heartbreak. So I become conscious of the plant world only when there is an absence. And I think there is this craving for literature on plants because there is this absence around us. Whether it's Dante, whether it's Kalidasa in Meghdutam. Let's take Kalidasa because you asked me to mention one of my favorite pieces of literature. See, it's supposed to be a love poem, right? Of Biraha, Shringar, that two lovers are separated, O cloud messenger, carry this song to my beloved. But you'll notice after the first few stanzas, Kalidasa gets rid of the love angle, if I might use a very cheap term, out of this equation right away. He uses the opportunity to use the cloud almost the way one uses a drone today.
Survey the geography.
Yes, and the amount of, I always think of attention as affection, as coeval. So the amount of attention Kalidasa gives to this landscape that is Bharat. So that kind of literature we did not enjoy as literature on plants. We enjoyed it as literature. Just as I should enjoy my conversation with you, not because of your identity backgrounds, the various identity backgrounds that you occupy. So I should feel as close to a plant as I do, say, to a lover, to my nephew, to my niece, and so on. You asked me to read a poem.
Yes,
I'll read a poem actually a song by Rabindranath Tagore. I've chosen to read this one because it is not very well known or popular. I also want to say that I read this as part of a growing urge that I sense among writers to look for a plant script, as it were. So whether it's his friend Jagadish Chandra Bose looking for a plant script, the plant's handwriting, he's looking for the language of plants. And I'm saying this only for those who might not understand Bangla. গোলাপ ফুল ফুটিয়ে আছে মধুপ হোতা যাস নে ফুলের মধু লুটিতে গিয়ে কাটার ঘা খাস নে হেথায় বেলা হোথায় চাপা শেফালি হোতা ফুটিয়ে ওদের কাছে মনের ব্যথা বল রে মুখ ফুটিয়ে ভ্রমর কহে হেথায় বেলা কোথায় আছে নলিনী ওদের কাছে বলিব নাকো আজিও যাহা বলিনি মরমে যাহা গোপন আছে গোলাপে তাহা বলিব বলিতে যদি জ্বলিতে হয় কাটারি ঘায়ে জ্বলিব.
Wonderful. How profound is that? Reading your book, Sumana ji, it also made me realize that in India, we hero worship scholars and great men in almost every field of knowledge. In medicine, in anthropology, in history, in space science. But when it comes to a botanist, our adulation starts and ends with Jagadish Chandra Bose, somebody who humanized the plants for us, and the way you have treeified or plantified human life.
Thank you.
And I see a parallel there. He has a home in Darjeeling, not too far from your own place in Siliguri. And in one of the longer chapters in this book, you describe your visit to Sir Bose's hometown and his home. Tell us about what was it like to visit the home of perhaps the best known botanist in India.
This was almost like not his summer home in that sense, but he did spend a lot of time here with his wife and sister Nivedita, who spent a lot of time here. From here, we have an exchange of letters to people across the world, but more particularly with his friend, Rabindranath Tagore, who was always asking him for plant cuttings for his home in Shantiniketan, not completely sure whether these mountainous plants, which in fact had been brought by colonial botanists from England and other parts of Europe to Darjeeling, whether they would grow there.
In Shantiniketan?
In Shantiniketan. My interest in Bose, as I just shared with you a little while ago, was very personal. it came at the very beginning from a place of being bullied by colleagues in my workplace. They thought I was plant mad, gach pagol.
What a
And
term that is,
yeah,
Gaj Pagul.
yeah. And I begin to wish that everyone was gach pagol, but we are all mad for something or the other. I think madness keeps us sane. So, one of a physicist, in fact, because you mentioned people of science, a physicist during a faculty council meeting said, "Oh, you love plants because you don't have children of your own." And no matter what, those words hurt. And there are these two phrases that the English language allows us now, whether you are childless or child free. And one doesn't know this about Jagadish Chandra Bose. But I also discovered other emotional parallels, his emotional intimacy with his nephew, something that I feel, and particularly when I was writing this book, my nephew had just been born and I had just started making these notes. And in fact, in my office, there is a drawing of his version or interpretation of the cover of How I Became a Tree. Um, he, as you know, began as a physicist,
Yes.
working on radio waves. There is perhaps enough, or I would say even lack of evidence to prove that he discovered things about radio waves much before perhaps Marconi did, that though we have no evidence to prove it.
Right.
His notes after the lecture were lost or stolen
Right.
from after his lecture in London. This, so what I want to relate this to is that I say Bose is a philosopher of life because he gives us a very emotional and intellectual definition of life. For him, the living are those who can respond. So whether it is in the radio sciences or in the plant sciences, he is able to prove that plants respond, and that is why plants should be considered living. This comes to him from this experiment that we would have done, Gautam, as children, which is touching the leaves of the plant
Yes.
may not. And he's walking through Calcutta, he touches this, and then begin these experiments with his tinsmith, Puttiram Das, sorry. Remember, this is colonial India, colonial Bengal. He's not being given a proper salary for teaching in Presidency College by his employers, these British scientists and administrators. But he creates these instruments. More, for want of time, I'll just mention one, the cresograph.
Cresograph, yes.
And his desire is just this, Gautam. Remember, he's doing all this during the high tide of modernism, of European modernism,
right.
but also which we recognize now was also the high tide of Bengali or Indian modernism.
Right.
And which
in
is
fact,
that- sorry.
The reference to Bengali modernism reminds me of Tagore and your chapter on Tagore and your visit to Uttarayan and the thrill at having discovered a book on trees of Shantiniketan.
Yeah.
Tell us something about that as well.
I'd like to, let me just draw this connection. So what he's doing is the autobiography, as you realized, or what would become today, what is today called the autofictional novel or autofiction. The autobiographical novel, you think of Woolf and many other people, Lawrence and so on, and the European modernists, they think that we need to speak for ourselves. And Bose wants to give this agency to plants, and hence this idea of Toru Lipi. Toru, plants, Lipi, script. So many of these plants that we see in Uttarayan, for instance, were a gift from Jagadish Chandra Bose, but also from other people, most significantly from the Maharaja of Tripura. So what is called this Uttarayan complex is a series of, or a sequence of 4 houses, as you know, that Tagore got built. Konark, Udichi and Shamoli, and the last one whose name I liked very much, which is Punascha, which means postscript, as it were. So this was influenced by his visits across the world. So the Japanese garden, you are aware of his travels to Japan, Japan Jatri, for instance, and how the Bengali modernists' interactions with Japan created this space for Bengal, the Bengal School of Art, as you are aware. But also very significantly, the gardener of this Uttarayan, of the Uttarayan gardens was actually, the first gardener was Raja Ram Mohan Roy's gardener. And because he was friends with Rabindranath's father, he almost came here. When Rabindranath's father comes here, he discovers a topsoil that is completely eroded, that cannot create life of the kind we see now. So I almost think of it as a person, he was a rishi, and he was using this space for sadhana, for meditation, for tapasya. So that is why the Chatim Tala, for instance. But we also have the Pakur Tala and the Neem Tala. This culture in the Indian subcontinent, this belief, this trust that sitting under a tree would give me something.
Right.
So,
Which in fact reminds me of the most famous tree in the world, the Bodhi tree, on which you have a chapter. And you visit to the tree and you look at the tree first through a couple of books, Deepak Kumar Barua's book, and you also mentioned Alexander Cunningham's book on the tree.
Yeah.
What was your impression of the tree? How do you look at the intimate history of Buddhism as told through the Bodhi tree and its many lores? A long question.
I know, I wouldn't require a long response. But I just want to say again, this came from a very, I wasn't setting out to do any kind of academic research, as you yourself kind of guess and understand. On the eve of my, around the time of my 40th birthday, I asked my husband that, I hadn't ever been able to ever ask anyone for a gift in my life. And I said, would you take me to see the Bodhi tree? And for someone turning 40, in the culture that we live in, 40 is no longer considered very old. So this question would have surprised him. But I was also aware that 10 years ago, Gautama Siddhartha had made this journey just a decade ago before, that particular age, he was 29, I think. And so when I went there, I was disappointed. It's a touristy place, obviously a tourism enabled by what Gautama had made of it, what had become of Uruvela. So to discover this tree, which is obviously not the tree that Siddhartha sat under, but the tree, as you mentioned, Alexander Cunningham. So I think of it as a kind of reverse post-colonial migration, as it were. So Ashoka, the King Ashoka, getting a branch of the tree, moved to Sri Lanka, and remember the person carrying it is Sanghamitra, his daughter. So Sangha, from the Sang, Mitra, a friend of the Sang. So Sanghamitra carries a branch of this tree, which is known as the Bo tree, to Ceylon, to Sri Lanka. And Alexander Cunningham, when he comes here in the 19th century, discovers that this history of violence on what we call the Bodhi tree has been first supposedly by Ashoka's wife, who was jealous, who got it burnt, who was jealous of the time that Ashoka was spending with it, almost as if this was a woman. So this tree and woman equivalence exists all through Buddhist literature and Vamsa literature as well, the Buddhist literature in Sri Lanka. And Cunningham gets a branch of this tree here because he realizes that the incense sticks and the fire that is being burnt is destroying this tree. So what we see today in the photographs that tourists like me, for instance, or people who are interested in the tree that we stand under or close to, and which is actually very movingly on stilts now, because they cannot bear the weight of that tree. So it was very moving to see a relative of the Buddha, because he made this equivalence to his first disciple, Ananda. He says, because people want to see the Buddha when he's not there, there's this concept of the Gandha Kutir, of a room of flowers, as it were. So when I am not there, people can come and experience this. So his idea of heaven also is a place which is soft, which does not have pebbles.
That's so enchanting.
It is.
Sumana ji, quite early in my childhood, I realized that plant life was sacred. We were asked not to kick a tree trunk or to spit on plants. not to touch them after the sunset? Or were we to point to a bud, a kali or a kodi as we called it? We could only do that with a crooked finger. There was tulsi, and then as years wore on, we added more plants of sacred significance to our little garden. We had banana plant as the board of Vishnu. We added blue aparajita for Shiva, of course java full for Devi. And then there was the shami plant, whose lushness was a measure of the prosperity and peace at home. How do you look at our relationship with plant as mediated theologically or ritually? How does it work in a country like Bharat?
I've thought about this a lot, the significance of rituals, for instance, and how rituals, because you needed these plants, even when rituals become dead and empty, as they have sometimes, not just in our culture but across the world, the necessity to keep these forms of plant life alive just for this, I think makes or creates an urge to do something that today we might identify in a very utilitarian manner as environmental activism. But I think of the qualities of haridra, turmeric, of the aparajita, of all the plants that you mentioned, of every single plant. And I would ask not just you, but those of us who are listening to us, to think of the Charaka Samhita,
Right.
the Sushruta Samhita,
Absolutely.
and to see. So when, for instance, I want to share this with you, because my nephew is so little and does not understand the significance of this literature. I tell him, because he's obsessed with the world of Superman and these Marvel comics, I tell him that every plant has a superpower. It has a magical power. So tulsi you have for this reason, haridra for this particular reason, the jackfruit for that reason, and so on. So you will see these rituals that we call rituals in a very shorthand manner are actually valorizing these magical powers in a very childlike manner, just so that they continue to be a part of the parliament of our existence, because they are necessary to us, but we are also necessary to them. So I think rituals recognize this interdependence in a way that we have moved away from. And I think if we kept these rituals alive in a real way, not in this dead way that we go and buy these flowers, but to have a tulsi, to have a neem tree, to have everything, at home, whatever home might be, might add something to our lives and to the air that we breathe.
And I wish we could go on at tree time and have a longer conversation, but I'm sure we'll have the opportunity for that. So thank you so much for being with us today and for the wonderful insights about tree life and the forms of tree life and the many people in India who recognize life in plants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gautam, for having me.
Thank you for watching Likhawat. We had an enchanting session with Dr. Sumana Roy talking about her book, How I Became a Tree. I'm your host, Gautam Choubey. We'll meet next week with a new book. Till then, keep watching Sansad TV. Namaste.